Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.com. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Tonight on the program, we will be joined by Larry Eichel, the Senior Advisor of the Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative at the Two Charitable Trusts. He'll be discussing the Uniformity Clause of the state constitution with us and how that impacts Philadelphia, and it's significant. We'll also have part two of our discussion with Dr. Artemy Kalinovsky, a professor at Temple University, specializing in the Soviet Union, Russia, foreign policy, Central Asia, interventions, and the Cold War, to discuss the current situation in Ukraine. And our own Lance Haver will be explaining to us the rise in oil prices. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. Nice to see both of you.
It's good to see you as always.
Too.
And Denise, how are you?
I'm good.
Well, that's great. So so we have a big show tonight, a lot to get to. So the first thing we're going to lead off with is our interview with Larry Eichel from the Pew Charitable Trusts. Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia with Larry Eichel, the Senior Advisor and Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Mr. Eichel, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be with you.
So Pew put out a very important article, very interesting article last week about the state uniformity clause and how that impacts Philadelphia. Can you tell us a little bit about what the uniformity clause is?
Yeah, I mean, the uniformity clause is a very short, simple part of the state constitution that was adopted in 1874. And it says, it's got a little bit other language, but the operative part is all taxes shall be uniform upon the same class of subjects. And lots of states have language like this in their constitution. The federal government actually uses the word uniform. Federal constitution uses the word uniformity as well. But what's different about Pennsylvania is the way it's been interpreted by the state courts. In most states, it seems to mean simply, if you and I have two pieces of property next to each other that are identical, they should be taxed the same. In Pennsylvania's case, what the justices have interpreted as meaning is that every type of asset, every category of income should be taxed the same. That is, all income shall be taxed at the same rate. All pieces of property should be taxed at the same rate. Like I say, other states have not agreed with this interpretation. As a result of that, for instance, we have a flat income tax in the state and a flat wage tax in Philadelphia that applies the same rate to everyone. And we have only one category of property. All property is taxed at the same rate. Again, in other places, that's not true. They have different rates for different types of property. So 47 states, I think it is, have uniformity clauses of some kind, and only 3 of them have interpreted it along the lines that Pennsylvania has.
And some of the examples you provide in the article, an office building worth $50 million has the same 1.3998% property tax rate as a home worth $50,000. Residents making $100 an hour have the same 3.8398% wage tax rate as those making $7.25 minimum wage. And the flat rate on the wage tax, as well as the 3.07% state income tax, helps give Philadelphia one of the nation's highest state and local burdens on low-income households, according to a study that was conducted by the District of Columbia. So how does this impact city tax revenues?
Well, I mean, obviously the city can impose any rates that it wants on within, I think, any rates on property or on wages. But it can't, because it can't graduate the taxes. Policymakers are very aware that if they raise the rate on property, it's raising the rate on the person who owns that $50,000 house. In the same way it is on the office building. You can't target tax increases in any way. You can't, because you can't change the rate. You can't vary the rate. So it really limits the options of policymakers. They can't target, it's very hard for them to target even tax breaks for the same reason. As I say, it's not so much that it limits their ability to raise revenue, but it limits their ability to raise revenue in a way that they see as being fair to everyone. And obviously, for those reasons, that they're reluctant to raise the rates. In the District of Columbia, for instance, on property, they have 6 different rates on 6 different categories of property, including 3 different rates on business, depending on the size of business, a different tax rate on vacant property, different on blighted property, and then one on residential property. Philadelphia can't do that. So when you're talking about not just about raising money, but if you're concerned about equity and trying to make a more equitable tax structure, to a large degree, the hands of Philadelphia are tied. Now, there are a lot of exceptions to the Uniformity Clause, which I'm sure we'll want to talk about, that are authorized by the legislature. But beyond those, there's not much the city can do.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because when you look at things like the tax abatement, Homestead Exemption, loop program, how are those programs able to exist with the Uniformity Clause?
Well, in 1968, the state of Pennsylvania adopted what's now called Section 2 of Article 8, which is where the uniformity language is, and it authorized the legislature to grant the state and local municipalities the power to adopt a number of programs that do only for specific purposes that would in some ways are workarounds to the Uniformity Clause. And for instance, the Homestead Exemption, which is one that's very, very well known, which exempts at the moment $45,000 evaluation for all owner-occupied homes. That's specifically authorized in the Constitution. The long-time owner occupancy program, which is seen widely as sort of a reaction to gentrification, it is allowed because that Section 2 of Article 8 of the Constitution allows relief for homeowners in areas where real property values have risen markedly. The tax abatement, the tax abatement, which was a 10-year tax abatement for a long time and has been revised to be somewhat less valuable starting this year, is allowed because that part of the Constitution says you can have abatements to encourage improvement of deteriorating property or areas. So the abatement is allowed under that. And in fact, we have in Philadelphia a rather little known and little utilized wage tax credit for low-income individuals that is also authorized by specific language in that part of the Constitution. You can't, and essentially, again, this is just the way these things have developed over time. The court has said you can't have a lower rate for low-income people, but you can have a tax credit for them under certain circumstances. So, people can apply for a rebate on the partial rebate on the wage tax. It's not a huge amount of money. It's a rather cumbersome process. It sort of piggybacks off a similar program credit for the state income tax, but it's there. But to get it, you got to know about it, and you got to fill out the paperwork, like I say, which is can be a pain. But it's there. So I mean, there are specific exceptions to uniformity. But when you get to the question of rates, the line has been drawn pretty clearly by the courts that there can only be one rate on a wage or income tax, only one rate on a property tax, and no categories of property allowing different rates.
I'd like to bring Denise Clay Murray here on WPPM 106.5.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Eichel, for giving us some of your time today. Are there any plans to try and kind of change the dynamics here? Because if you are, charging poor people, especially in the poorest big city in the nation, the same tax rates as you do higher income people, that's going to affect folks differently. And there's no uniformity in that.
Right. There is, as far as I know, there is no effort to sort of change the clause in a sweeping way. About a decade ago, the State Bar Association put together a group to revise the Constitution, to consider constitutional revisions, and they specifically called for a constitutional amendment that would make it clear that the uniformity clause allows for graduated tax rates and allows for different classes of property. And that recommendation was published, and that was that. Nothing ever happened to it. There was an effort several years ago, backed by Paul Levy, the president of the Center City District, and Jerry Sweeney from Brandywine Realty Trust, to try to get an amendment to the Constitution that would have a very limited one, that would have applied only to Philadelphia, and would allow the city to create a separate higher tax rate for commercial property. And the idea was that the money would be used to reduce wage and business taxes. But that amendment eventually didn't get through the legislature. A lot of people in the city, including the city council president, objected to it. But even that was not about setting different tax rates. It was about setting different tax rates for different kinds of property, but not for different individuals. It was designed, however, as a way to lower the wage tax for everyone. But there has been no movement at all toward any kind of graduated rate on the wage tax.
Now, you said that part of the reason why the taxes used the way that it is because of how it's interpreted. Why is it interpreted this way? Has anyone, ever talked to you about that?
Well, it's really hard to tell. Because we're talking about over 100 years of court precedents, and when this language was adopted in 1874, neither the city nor the state had an income tax. It's hard to figure exactly the way this is developed. But when you have court precedents over a century, they're hard to overturn. There are only two ways to overturn it. One is through a constitutional amendment. and the other would be bringing a case to the court and for the court to say, we want to change the way it's been interpreted. Both of those are very difficult kind of long shots. And I don't know of any case that is moving. I don't know of any test case that is moving forward. There's no move to have a constitutional amendment too. I mean, part of it is the idea of tax uniformity. When you say it, I mean, that sounds like a good idea. Everybody should be treated fairly under the tax system, and most of the litigation surrounding the Uniformity Clause has been about property taxes and property assessments. And there are lots of attorneys and others who would say, well, the Uniformity Clause is really important because if somebody's house gets assessed for $200,000 more than somebody else's house, the Uniformity Clause allows them to go in and say, hey, by the uniformity, we're not being treated uniformly. So a lot of there's a lot of support for it in that regard. I think it's, and as far as on the wage tax and income taxes, it's both a case. It would have to be a case of an amendment allowing there to be graduated taxes, and then the legislator or city council willing to adopt graduated taxes. So it's a very complicated situation and very hard to change.
Now, the city has been trying to get rid of the wage tax. You hear a lot of talk in council about getting rid of the wage tax, phasing it out, or not relying so heavily on it, because one of the things that they noticed during the pandemic is our over-reliance on the wage tax really impacted our budget. Would another, I guess the question I want to ask is, under the Uniformity Clause, everybody has to be, taxed the same way and taxed at the same rate. If you get rid of a tax like the wage tax, is that impacted by that?
No, not at all. I mean, there's nothing in the Uniformity Clause that would prevent the city from getting rid of the wage tax. I mean, obviously, what discourages the city from getting rid of the wage tax is the question of, where do you get the revenue to replace the the wage tax is about half of the city's locally generated taxes. It's a huge amount of money, and where do you replace that? I mean, there's been talk by tax commissions in the past and others about gradually sort of shifting the wage tax, the money raised by the wage tax to the property tax. And that's not a very popular idea either, especially when you have the Uniformity Clause that prevents there from being higher rates for commercial and industrial property. So the Uniformity Clause figures into it that way, but the Uniformity Clause would not prevent the city from doing away with the wage tax or any other tax.
Okay, now, how can citizens impress upon their lawmakers that there needs to be some wiggle room with the Uniformity Clause if that's what they think they need? Because, like I said, you have some people who are, not well off in the poorest big city in America, and if the people who are making more and getting more are paying less in taxes than they are, that's not uniform. How can citizens, talk to their lawmakers about this? Is there anything that they can do?
Not sure I would agree with your assertion that people with higher incomes are paying less. I mean, they're paying the same rate. Look, I think local officials are very aware of the way the uniformity clause ties their hands. They would love to see it change. But I think they feel that there is no way for them to change because it would require, as I said, either a constitutional amendment or a court to go against a half a century of precedent. It's funny that there are things that the city has done even beyond the sort of the specific exceptions that the state constitution now allows. There are things the city has done to get around the uniformity clause. One is the use of occupancy tax, which is not specifically authorized in the state state constitution, and it is a tax on commercial. It's in essence a property tax on commercial property, although that's not what it's called. It's been deemed constitutional because it's not a tax on the property; it's on the tax of the use of property, which is one of those distinctions that lawyers like. So that tax is imposed on commercial property, and the proceeds go to the school district. And another thing that the city has done in trying to revise its business taxes, the BERT tax, the city recently moved a number of years ago to exempt the first $200,000 of receipts that a business has from the BERT tax, and as I read the uniformity clause, that might not pass muster by a court if anyone were to challenge it. No one has challenged it, and I think city officials are hoping no one ever does. But those are the kinds of little things that the city can do, has done, that in their view try to make things more fair.
Okay, thank you. And Larry, do you have another question?
The last thing I'd just like to bring up, I can't remember exactly where it was. Maybe it was Montgomery County, where they tried to do a reassessment, but only on businesses. And that was challenged and was viewed as a violation of the uniformity clause. So even when, counties and local governments try to get creative with this, as you said, it's still subject to challenge, and it seems like it's very constraining for local governments. Yeah,
actually, the case you're talking about is actually a Philadelphia case. It's called Duffield House Associates versus the City of Philadelphia, and it's been ruled on by the Commonwealth Court, and the city's appealing it to the state Supreme Court. And essentially, what happened was that for the 2018 tax year, basically ever since the coming of AVI, the Actual Value Initiative in 2014, the idea there was that the city would reassess properties regularly, perhaps even annually, which it had not done in the past. It has been unable to do that for a number of reasons, including technology and the number of appeals that were filed against the reassessments in 2014. But one thing they did in 2018 was they reassessed all the commercial property, basically claiming that it was very much saying it was very much underassessed. A lot of the commercial concerns got together and filed a lawsuit and they won at trial. They won on appeal to the Commonwealth Court, and it's pending to the state Supreme Court. And my understanding is that there's basically about $48 million at stake here that the city might or might not have to refund in those higher taxes. I actually, in the course of doing this report, I asked a lawyer has tried a lot of cases involving the uniformity clause. Again, most of them involving property. I said, so if the city of Philadelphia decided, hey, we really would like to reassess every property in the city on an annual basis, but that's just too hard. It's too much work. We can't do it. But we'll do commercial property one year, residential property the next, and go on like that every other year, doing one or the other. I said, could you make a uniformity clause argument against doing it that way? And he said he thought he could, which then kind of sounds ridiculous. But the courts have interpreted uniformity in a very kind of strict way, which is not to say that's how they would interpret it in a case like that. But it was interesting that he thought that he would have an argument that the courts would take as a serious, reasonable argument, that doing it that way was not appropriate. So the uniformity clause has a lot of power, especially in these cases involving property assessments. There's just a tremendous long line of precedent in that regard. Not so much on the income side; it just hasn't been tried as much because those rules are pretty clear. It's kind of hard to go against them, but the property cases keep coming up, and the uniformity clause plays a very powerful role in those cases.
Okay. Well, Mr. Larry Eichel, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you guys.
Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.com. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. And we'd like to thank Mr. Larry Eichel for being with us and giving us a lot of information about something that I don't know that a lot of people really know about. So it was really good to get it out there, and we're going to have more on that throughout the year. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Lance to tell us a little bit about these oil prices.
Hi. I was a little surprised to hear Mr. Eichel didn't mention that one of the difficulties in Pennsylvania is just how new our Constitution is. Our Constitution was done in 1968. Most of the other states in the country have much older constitutions. So by 1968, the lobbyists had known how to get in there and make sure that business got everything it wanted.
Mm-hmm.
I was also a little surprised to hear that no one's challenged the Uniformity Act in the same way that Ruth Bader Ginsburg challenged some of the sexist acts, doing it in reverse. So, for example, I'm surprised no one's thought of challenging the Homestead Act, the Homestead reduction, to get the court to say it's legal and get as broad an opinion as possible. But hopefully those things will come up in the future. And I'm really not going to talk about that any longer because I have what I think is very upsetting news about oil and gas prices. And I'm hoping everyone can see the screen. So you'll have to let me know, Larry and Denise, whether you can see the screen.
We can see it.
Okay, so I'm sure it's not a surprise that everyone knows that gas has gone up. But how much might be a little bit of a surprise. It's gone up 50% in 1 year. So these averages come from the American Automobile Association, which most people recognize as AAAs. A year ago, for regular, we were paying $2.87. Now we're paying $4.30. And it's just an unbelievable increase in a very short period of time. And because so much of our economy runs on oil, fertilizer, heating gas, heating oil, production, it has a tremendous impact on inflation. What we now know, though, is that there's really not a connection between the oil prices, the crude oil prices and gasoline prices. So this week, natural gas at the pump went up 1.2%. And that's while the oil prices fell. And here's a chart that shows what's happened to the oil prices just recently. And I think it's very clear that the oil prices have fallen dramatically. As of yesterday, at the close of the market, oil prices, crude oil prices, had fallen by 22%. That would equate to a 98-cent reduction at the pump. So the gas prices should have gone down by 98 cents. Instead, what AAA says is they actually went up by 1.2%. And you can see through the chart that it's not connected, but yet the oil companies have an opportunity to use an increase in the oil prices, to use the war in the Ukraine, the invasion by Russia into the Ukraine, as an excuse to raise the oil prices and then raise the gas prices. So why did the gas prices go up so quickly? Is there any reason for it? And the honest answer is no. The gas that you put in your car wasn't in a well the day before you pumped it into your car. In the best of times, it takes roughly 4 weeks to get the crude oil out of the ground to the pipeline, to the refinery to the storage, from the storage to the gas station, from the gas station into your car. Now, if it takes 4 weeks for it to happen, why, if oil goes up overnight, does gas go up overnight? And we know from everything we've been told that there are all these delays going on, that we have all these problems with what we say is our supply line. And so the 4 weeks is overly optimistic, because even though we have plenty of oil in the United States, the corporations that control the oil and gas supplies still choose to have oil shipped from overseas to be processed in the United States. So the gas in our cars, the gas that we pump from the station into our car, wasn't crude oil yesterday or last week or even a month ago. There's absolutely no reason why it goes up overnight. The argument that there is a shortage of crude oil in the world, again, just simply isn't true. The General Secretary of OPEC, and that's the organization of oil-producing countries that export oil, has said, yes, the oil futures markets have gone up by 30%, but there's no physical shortage of oil as of this morning. He said this last week. And we know that there's no physical shortage of oil because many of us who are my age remember that when there were shortages, the government stepped in and said you can't buy gas every day, you can only buy it every other day, and there were restrictions on actually putting gas in your car. So there's plenty of oil in the world supply, and there's plenty of gas in the world supply for the United States. I'm not talking about what's going on in Ukraine, where it's a very difficult situation, a real struggle. And what I'm talking about there has nothing to do, what's going on there has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. So there's no shortage of oil. We have plenty. And the question becomes, even if there was a shortage, because of the Russian, we're no longer going to allow corporations to buy oil from Russia, will that create a shortage in the future? Well, according to the president of the Texas Independent Producers, Texas could ramp up production to fill any global void that was created by a decision to stop importing oil from Russia. Texas alone, just Texas, not Alaska, not Louisiana, not the offshore oil wells. Texas alone is the world's 5th largest producer of oil. So if Texas wanted to, if the oil corporations that control the wells in Texas wanted to, they could easily increase production to fill any single void that they wanted to. The question we have to ask ourselves realistically is, why would they want to do that when every week gas prices continue to go up and the oil that's in the ground increases in value? If they pump that oil out and the price of gas goes down, they're actually cutting their own profits. Now, why would they do that if they didn't have to? And it's not an unknown fact. The chief oil analyst for the Oil Price Information Service says prices go up like a rocket and come down like a feather. The oil corporations know this is what happens. They have a great opportunity when there's a world conflict. And again, we used to call this war profiteering. But when people are being killed, when there's an invasion and there's a disruption in the traditional ways that oil gets to the world, the oil corporations take advantage of that by raising the prices, and the prices shoot up. And what we're seeing is that Tom Closa is absolutely right. Again, oil prices fell by 22% last week. That should have been a 98-cent reduction in the price of gasoline. And instead of gasoline going down by 98%, it went up by a penny and a half. The prices shoot up like a rocket and come down like a feather. Nobody in the oil industry or in the wealth industry or in the investing industry or who follow these issues believes that stopping the import of Russian oil is going to have an effect on the American market. Again, different for the Europeans, certainly different for the Ukrainians, but we're only talking about gas right now in the American market. And I'm going to read you the quote because it just says everything. This comes from the Senior Vice President of Fidelity's Asset Allocation Research Team. U.S. sanctions on Russia, quote, U.S. sanctions on Russian oil represent an escalation, but they are not really a game changer in the sense that the U.S. imports very little Russian oil. So far this year, Russian crude oil has accounted for less than 1% of all the crude oil imported to the United States. And as we saw earlier, Texas has such an unbelievably large supply, they could fill that one. If there was a 1% gap, they could fill it overnight. So why did the prices go up? Why did they do it? And we really, if we focus on what are called integrated oil corporations, we have to ask, why do they raise prices at all? Now, an integrated company is a company that owns the oil in the ground, owns the shipping or the pipeline to get it to the refinery, owns the refinery, owns the way of getting it from the refinery into the storage tanks, owns the storage tanks, and owns the distribution. So these are companies that are actually selling oil to themselves. They're not controlled by the world market. They're not controlled by the spot market, and they're not controlled by the futures market. They simply decide on a piece of paper how much they're going to charge themselves for every barrel of oil that comes out of the well they own, and how much they're going to charge themselves for how much they're going to charge to refine that oil. And they're going to decide how much to charge us. Yes, there are a handful of smaller companies that don't own their own refineries, don't own their own pipelines, and even don't own their own wells. And there are some independent companies that only retail gas, that only sell it. But all of the integrated companies who control the market prices, again, completely control the setting of all the prices, from the crude oil to the refining to the transportation to what they have their retailers sell that at. And there's no shortage of integrated companies in America. The list of the 8 largest American corporations, and I use America in quotes because there's really nothing American about these. These are just companies that are owned by wealthy stockholders. They have no allegiance to any country. They only have an allegiance to their stockholders. But if you look at the list, you'll know the companies. ExxonMobil owns the wells, the refineries, and the gas stations. Chevron, BP, ConocoPhillips, Phillips 66, Marathon Petroleum, Valero, and even the much smaller Hess owns its own oil wells, its own refineries, and its own gas stations. None of these companies are affected by the spot market price of a barrel of oil unless they want to be. Each one of these companies owns the oil in the well and can decide what they're going to charge themselves and how much markup they're going to have. And you might say, well, the oil companies really need to raise price because they haven't been doing that well. Well, again, that would not be the case. Now, the stock market is in flux, and the war in Ukraine, the invasion by the Russians, has really made the stock market volatile. But as of last week, the Dow Jones U.S. Oil and Gas Total Stock Market Index is up almost 35%. And this analysis comes from an investment counselor called Investment Place, which is an independent financial firm, meaning that they don't sell stocks and bonds. They're not a retailer. They simply do analysis for people who are interested in getting more information. Chevron stock is up 47% year to date. ConocoPhillips up 39%. ExxonMobil up 40%, 44%. Phillips 66 in 2022 has returned 18%, and Shell Oil up 19% to date. So it's not as if the oil companies aren't making enough money, and that's why they have to increase the price of oil that they already own, that they already control, that they already decide what to set the price. They're not hurting. They're doing very well. In fact, these are among the best reporting stocks right now in our nation. What does the industry want? Why are they doing this? Well, they want higher oil and gas prices. As the Alliance of Energy Producers says, higher oil and gas prices mean more money for Texas producers and could lead to an industry growth in the near term. That's what they want. They simply want more money. And the question for us is, should we say that war profiteering is an acceptable thing? Should we turn a blind eye and say, we know the pain and suffering of the Ukrainian people has a direct correlation to the increase in profits of the oil companies, and that's okay? Or should we say that's not okay? I believe that most Americans are willing to sacrifice, and most Americans are willing to pay for more at the pump if we have to, if that money went to help the Ukrainians, if that money went to make the world a safer place, if that money meant that we would have renewable energy so that the Russian oil market would fall and the Russians would lose the money they need to fight the war. I believe most of us would agree to that. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is very simple. We're paying higher prices, and that money is going to lead to higher dividend checks and to companies buying back their own shares. Our higher prices at the pump lead directly to higher returns for the stockholders of the integrated oil companies. Oil companies are not social service agencies. These are not people who are running hospitals. These are not people who are helping adopt children. These are not people who are trying to make sure that poverty is eliminated. These are people whose goal is to make as much money as possible. Now, I don't agree with other people who think that there's something wrong with that. That is the role that we have assigned them in our law, in our society, which has checks and balances. We say that a for-profit business is in business to make money. We say a not-for-profit is in business to deliver a service. But to suggest that if the oil company is there to make money, we should blame it for making money, to me, doesn't make any sense. In fact, legally, if the CEO of Mobil Exxon decided to withhold all of the dividends from the stockholders and take that money and send it directly to the Ukrainians, he wouldn't be legally allowed to do it. The state of Delaware, which is where almost every corporation is headquartered, requires that CEOs must make stockholder welfare the sole end of corporate governance within the limits of their legal discretion. And this idea is not a new one, and it's not one that comes from free market people. This idea really came from A.A. Burley, who was one member of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's think tank in getting the United States out of what was called the Great Depression. A.A. Burley was a progressive. He's been gone many, many years. And what he argued was that unless the CEO of a company was responsible to the owners of the company, the CEO could simply steal from the company and it wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't break a law. There wouldn't be anything wrong. And he writes, when the fiduciary obligation of the corporate management and control to stockholders is weakened or eliminated, the management and control become, for all practical purposes, absolute. So there's A.A. Burley, who's saying to to FDR, you've got to rein in the corporations. You've got to regulate the corporations. You have to make sure that there's powerful unions, that there's checks and balances on the power of corporations, saying we recognize in our structured society that the role of business is to make money. And we have to, as a society, tell business under which rules can they operate. We can't expect the business to do anything other than do what we say they can do. And we can't expect them to go from being a for-profit to a not-for-profit that's feeding the world. It's not a realistic expectation. So the oil companies, aside from increasing their profits and increasing their dividends and making sure that the prices skyrocket up like a rocket and float down like a feather, have actually said that they're going to hold us hostage. The American Petroleum Institute, API, which is the trade group for the oil producers, has called on the White House to release more permits for drilling on federal lands. And that they're completely ignoring the fact that there are nearly 13 million acres of public lands that are already leased, and that the oil companies have literally stockpiled thousands of unused leases. But they want to use this emergency to go ahead and make sure that they can get even more leases. They want to make sure that they're going to get to drill offshore. Now, we know that this is an environmental problem, but again, they don't want to miss an opportunity. They want to do away with all the environmental concerns about infrastructure improvements, and they want to reduce legal and regulatory uncertainty. They're not shy about this. This is what they say. This is not a hidden agenda. This is not something that you have to sneak around and find out. They tweet this. They're proud of this. This is what they say will solve our problem, which, by the way, they created. They're members of the API, created the problem by jacking up the price. And now they're saying, if you give us all these things, we'll solve the problem by reducing the price. Now, there are some movements right now in Congress, in the Senate. Senator Warren, Sanders, and White House and others have calling for a windfall profit. And that really becomes the issue. And forgive me, I'm going to just shut down the slideshow if I can. And thank you. And that really becomes the issue. What do we say is acceptable? There was a time in my lifetime when war profiteering was one of the worst things you could accuse someone of. And that's exactly what's going on now. But so many of us are well-intentioned and really want to help the Ukrainians that we have the Inquirer writing editorials saying we shouldn't complain about the rise in gas prices. We have people who, again, are really good people, really concerned about the devastation, saying, if I have to pay a little more at the gas pump to help the Ukrainians, I'm going to do it. But the fact remains, not a single penny more that you pay at the pump helps a single Ukrainian. The only way to do that would be for our government to have a backbone to step in, to say war profiteering is always immoral and should always be illegal, and to pass a tax and take that money and use it so that we have a better opportunity for peace going forward.
Well, Lance, thank you so much for telling us about that and walking us through that. It's astounding to me that they're getting away with this.
It's, again, part of the reason is because we're all so decent. We all are saying, it's hard to watch the Ukrainians on the news and not want to do something. And so if someone says, well, you suffer a little bit to reduce their suffering, you say, I want to do something, so I'll do that. And we're naive to not recognize the power of the public relations of the oil companies. I know most of us don't watch the hearings, but the oil companies are saying we're patriots. We wouldn't do that. But in fact, the vertically integrated companies don't have to buy a single barrel of oil from anyone. They own their own oil. They're choosing to buy the oil so that they have an excuse to raise the price. If oil goes up to $100 a barrel, that means the oil in their well goes up as well, and they don't have to do anything. Hence the term a windfall profit. Oil goes up, the oil that's in the ground becomes worth more.
Well, Lance, thank you so much for walking us through that. And we're going to have that on our Twitter and Facebook page so people can see it. Now, speaking of Ukraine, we are now going to have part 2 of our interview with Dr. Artemy Kalinovsky, a professor at Temple University, who told us a little bit about what's happening in Ukraine and why we are where we are. We're probably not going to get the whole thing in tonight, but we'll post this as well.
So one of the things that has stood out to me about the whole thing with Ukraine is the spotlight it's put on the country's relations with communities of color. In the beginning, when people were trying to get out, you saw pictures of people from India, students from Africa, and other places that were trying to get out that were not allowed on trains. Can you talk a little bit about why, I guess, first of all, why would an African medical student come to the Ukraine to learn medicine in the first place? And a little bit about, what's going on with particularly their communities of color. And because I understand that, they have issues with India as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I mean, the history lesson part of this is the easiest one for me because this is actually something that I study, right? The Soviet Union's relations with post-colonial countries and so forth. And that goes back to, well, it goes back to the 1920s and 30s, but especially to the 1950s, where the Soviet Union basically said, one of the ways we're going to compete with the United States is we're going to offer a free education to post-colonial countries and to developing countries that are friendly with us. And so you had several universities that were set up explicitly for that purpose, right? So, and one of them still exists. That's Patrice Lumumba University of, what is it called? Patrice Lumumba University of the Friendship of the Peoples in Moscow. That's still around. But all the universities across the Soviet Union, and not just universities, I mean, military academies, technical schools, all of them, accepted students from around the world. And that's one of the legacies, right? I mean, they've had these, you have these linkages that are set up. They have pretty good reputations in terms of the education that they provide. And, there's also, people, if you're kind of an aspiring doctor, right? And you're thinking about, okay, where should I go study if I'm going to go abroad, right? Maybe you have the resources, to pay for Ukrainian medical school, but not for American medical school. Or maybe, your uncle went to school in Ukraine and said, well, I had great professors there and, look how well I've done. So I think this is why people are still going there. In Russia, they also, will face racism and discrimination. I think probably more in provincial cities than in Moscow or Petersburg. As for what happened at the borders, that I can't say anything for sure because I've only seen the same news that you have. I suspect that, somebody decided, okay, Ukrainian citizens are, the most in trouble and they have to get out first. Perhaps, I really don't know what actually was going on there.
Okay. And I'd like to bring on my co-host. Thank you. And I'd like to bring on my co-host, Larry McGlynn, because he had some questions. And go ahead, Larry.
Thank you, Denise. And Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. The first thing I'd like to ask you about, you've studied Russia's involvement in Afghanistan extensively. Mm-hmm. Do you see any parallels between this situation in Ukraine and Russia's involvement in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit early to say. I think one thing, when I was researching the Soviet war in Afghanistan, right, I was very interested in, initially understanding why they went in the first place. And one of the things we learned in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and the archives were opened up is, we got access to the Politburo records where they discussed Afghanistan in 78, 79. And in March of 79, they're asked to go in. There's a rebellion in the city of Herat, and they're asked to go in by the government in Kabul. And they ultimately decide not to. And in the Politburo meetings, they go through all the reasons that going in would be a terrible idea, right? And they talk about, we're going to end up fighting ordinary people. We're going to have all these problems with the West. The developing countries aren't going to support this. We're going to be isolated, et cetera, et cetera. So they understood that it was wrong. And yet by December 1979, they convinced themselves they have no other choice. Right. So the problem isn't that they don't understand what the problem is, right, or what's going to be difficult about this. The problem is that they convince themselves they have no other choice, and in that case, it has to do with the Iranian Revolution, the fact that they think that America is going to take advantage of instability in Afghanistan, and so on. And then all their kind of predictions turn out to be right. So one of the things I think that must have happened here is something similar, right? It's not that. Putin didn't have access to experts who would have said, well, actually the Ukrainians are not going to welcome us with open arms. And, the West might actually rally in this case and not be happy with this. But somehow he had convinced himself, or, enough of his cronies helped him convince himself that this was going to work. So that was one thing. I think there's a few other interesting legacies. I mean, one of them is that, at the end of the war in Afghanistan, in the late 80s, you have this period of openness under Mikhail Gorbachev, perestroika, glasnost, and you had one of the first real civil society organizations in the former Soviet Union was something called the Soldiers' Mothers Organization. And these were mothers of conscripts who kind of made it a point of documenting mistreatment of soldiers in the military. And campaigning for them to kind of not be sent to Afghanistan and so on. And that organization still exists today, right? And I think in a way, the fact that the military got opened up to that kind of scrutiny also acted as a brake on, where that military was going to be sent, right? So if you look at where the Russian military has been deployed over the last 30 years, I mean, it was used in Chechnya, but Chechnya was a part of Russia, right? It was not used much in the post-Soviet space at all, right? Not during the civil war in Tajikistan when, Russia was involved with intelligence and its border troops were there, but they were officially neutral. So not really until Syria.
We would like to thank Dr. Kolonovsky for being with us. We will put that entire interview on our Twitter and Facebook pages, so they'll all be there. We'd like to thank Larry Eichel for being with us tonight. And we'd also like to thank our co-hosts, Lance Haver. Thank you for your report. Denise, thank you for your Larry Eichel and Dr. Kolonovsky interview. Next week on the show, we're going to have Councilmember Catherine Gilmore Richardson. And Lance will be back to tell us about the Federal Reserve today raised interest rates. So Lance is going to explain to us what that means and what it could mean for Philadelphia. So we'd like to thank you for watching the show. Please go to our Facebook page, WPPM, our Twitter page at Hall Monitor WPPM, and our website, www.hallmonitor.org. Thank you all for being with us.
Good night.
Good night.